Nicole Kidman has made her first public appearance since her split from Keith Urban.
We've been through a lot together.
We've got a timeline for it now, and the time it's now.
For nearly a decade, Nicole Kidman and Keith Urban seemed like Hollywood's perfect match. Two artistic giants, creating a fairy tale romance that captivated millions. But behind the red carpets and award show moments, a different story was unfolding. When their marriage ended in 2014, the world watched. But what Nicole shared in the years after revealed uncomfortable truths about sacrifice, identity, and the cost of loving someone in the spotlight. This is a story of what really happened between two of entertainment's most talented stars, and the raw confessions that followed. But what nobody realized was that this love story was built on a foundation neither of them was truly prepared for. It was 2006 when Nicole Kidman and Keith Urban first met. She was already a global superstar, an Oscar winner, a Hollywood legend who had survived a very public marriage to Tom Cruise. She was 39 years old, successful beyond measure, but also searching for something real, something genuine, something that felt like home. Keith Urban was different. He wasn't a traditional Hollywood actor. He was a musician, raw, talented, and deeply connected to his art. He had struggled with addiction, fought his way back to sobriety, and was finally rebuilding his career. When they met at a charity event, something clicked. It wasn't the typical Hollywood romance. It felt authentic. It felt like two broken people finding each other. They fell hard. Within months, Keith proposed with a massive diamond ring. Nicole said yes. The world watched in amazement. Here was Nicole Kidman, one of the most powerful women in cinema, and she was choosing love. She was choosing Keith Urban. It seemed like a fairy tale. In 2006, they got married in a private ceremony in Sydney, Australia. The media loved the story. A powerhouse actress and a talented musician building a life together. They had two children, Sunday Rose and Faith Margaret. Nicole stepped back from some major film roles to focus on family. She gave up certain opportunities. She made sacrifices that nobody really talked about at the time. From the outside, it looked perfect. They walked red carpets together. They supported each other's careers. Keith toured, recorded albums. Nicole did films when the timing worked. They seemed balanced. They seemed happy. The tabloids called them one of Hollywood's strongest couples. But behind closed doors, something different was happening. The pressures of maintaining two massive careers, raising children, and living in constant public scrutiny were taking a toll that nobody could see from the photographs and magazine covers. What Nicole would later reveal changed how everyone understood their relationship. But what people don't understand about two superstars being together is that it's not romantic. It's a constant negotiation. Nicole Kidman had spent her entire adult life building an empire. She was used to being the center of attention. She made the decisions. She controlled her narrative. She was a star. But when you marry another successful person, something shifts. You can't both be the main character in the same story. And in a marriage like theirs, that created invisible friction. In interviews years later, Nicole began opening up about what was really like. She talked about the sacrifices she made. She discussed stepping away from major film roles when the kids were young. She mentioned turning down projects because Keith was on tour. She spoke about the guilt, the constant, crushing guilt of trying to balance being a mother, a wife, and one of the world's most talented actresses. Keith had his own pressures. He was touring constantly, performing for thousands of people every night. He was recording albums. He was trying to maintain his career momentum while also being a father and a husband. The touring meant he was away for weeks, sometimes months at a time. Nicole was at home with the children. They were living separate lives, even though they were married. In 2010, Nicole did an interview where she mentioned feeling isolated during certain periods. She didn't name Keith directly, but the implication was clear. There were stretches of time where she felt alone in the marriage, alone with the kids, alone with her career choices, alone with the weight of keeping everything together. The media noticed. Tabloids started speculating. Were they having problems? Were they struggling? Celebrity gossip sites ran stories about trouble in paradise. But Nicole and Keith never confirmed anything. They kept smiling for the cameras. They kept showing up together. What nobody reported on was the internal struggle. Nicole was battling with her identity. She had given up certain roles, certain opportunities, to make the marriage work. She had become Mrs. Keith Urban in some ways, even though she was still Nicole Kidman, the actress. That contradiction was eating away at her. Keith was battling his own demons. The pressure of maintaining sobriety while touring, while dealing with a high-pressure marriage, while being constantly scrutinized by the media. It was overwhelming. Years later, both would acknowledge how difficult those years truly were. By 2012, cracks were showing. They were still together, still married, but something fundamental had shifted. The fairy tale was starting to feel like a different kind of story altogether. And then came the moment that would change everything. By 2013, Nicole Kidman was 46 years old. She had won Oscars, built an incredible career, and raised two beautiful children. But somewhere along the way, she had lost something she couldn't quite name. In later interviews, she would describe it as losing herself. She wasn't the only one struggling. Keith Urban was also at crossroads. The marriage that felt so perfect in 2006 had become complicated, demanding, and increasingly difficult to maintain. Both were successful. Both were driven. But success in two separate fields meant they were constantly pulling in different directions. In 2013, things came to a head. Nicole had been offered roles that excited her, films that required her full attention and commitment. But they conflicted with family time. They conflicted with Keith's touring schedule. She was facing the same impossible choice she'd faced for years, her career or her family. But this time, something was different. This time, she was tired of choosing. There were reports of arguments. Not the dramatic, explosive kind you see in movies, but the quiet, exhausting kind that comes from two people who love each other but can't figure out how to make it work. The kind of arguments where both people are right and both people are wrong and neither person knows how to fix it. Keith was dealing with pressures Nicole couldn't fully understand. Being a touring musician meant being away from home constantly. It meant living a different life on stage and on the road than he lived at home. That compartmentalization takes a toll. Nicole wanted more presence. Keith couldn't give it without sacrificing his career. It was a stalemate. In interviews years later, Nicole would be remarkably honest about this period. She talked about how she had compromised so much of herself for the marriage. She discussed the guilt she felt for resenting that compromise. She mentioned how she had become someone she didn't entirely recognize, a version of herself that was smaller, quieter, less ambitious than she wanted to be. What made it even more painful was that neither of them was doing anything wrong. Keith wasn't a bad husband. Nicole wasn't a demanding wife. They were two incredibly talented people trying to exist in the same marriage, and the math simply didn't work. Their careers demanded too much. Their personalities were too strong. Their needs were too different. By late 2013, the relationship had shifted into something neither of them wanted to admit. They were co-parenting more than they were partnering. They were existing in the same space, but they weren't truly connecting anymore. The distance had become physical and emotional. In October 2014, it became official. Nicole Kidman and Keith Urban announced their separation. The fairy tale was over. The perfect Hollywood romance had ended. But what Nicole would reveal in the months and years after the divorce would shock people who thought they understood the story. What Nicole Kidman said after the divorce was nothing like what the tabloids had predicted. She didn't blame Keith. She didn't accuse him of anything. Instead, she did something far more powerful. She took responsibility. She explained what really happened. And in doing so, she exposed something that most people never want to admit about high-pressure marriages. Sometimes, two good people simply can't make it work, no matter how much they love each other. In a 2016 interview with Vogue, Nicole was remarkably candid. She talked about the sacrifices she had made. She discussed how she had stepped back from certain roles to prioritize family. She acknowledged that she had resented those sacrifices over time, even though she loved her children and wanted to be present for them. It was the kind of honesty that rarely comes from celebrities, raw, vulnerable, and uncomfortably real. She also spoke about identity. Nicole explained that over the course of the marriage, she had lost touch with who she was as an individual. She had become Mrs. Keith Urban in some ways, and that version of herself didn't have room for the ambitious, driven Nicole Kidman, who had won Oscars and built an empire. The compromise had cost her something essential. But here's what made her words so powerful. She didn't blame Keith for this. She took ownership of her own choices. She acknowledged that she had made decisions to step back, to compromise, to prioritize family, and those decisions had consequences. She wasn't a victim. She was someone who had made choices in real time, based on what she believed was right at that moment. And those choices had shaped her life in ways she hadn't fully anticipated. Do you think it's possible to maintain your individual identity while being in a committed relationship with someone equally ambitious? Or does real partnership require sacrifice? Share your thoughts below. What Nicole also revealed was that Keith had been supportive of her career. He hadn't demanded she stay home. He hadn't told her to quit acting. The limitation was more subtle and more complex. It was the reality of managing two massive careers, two children, and a marriage that required constant attention. Something had to give, and it was Nicole who had made the sacrifice, not because Keith forced her, but because she felt it was what a good mother should do. After the separation, Nicole became more selective with her roles. She took on projects that truly excited her. She worked with directors she admired. She reclaimed that part of herself that had been dormant, and in doing so, she thrived. Her career actually accelerated after the divorce. She won more acclaim. She took more risks. She became more herself. In a way, the marriage had ended not because of infidelity or betrayal, but because two people had made sacrifices that ultimately cost them their connection to each other. It was a tragedy of compromise, a situation where both people lost something essential in trying to make it work. But what nobody expected was what Nicole would reveal about the final nail in the coffin. In 2017, 3 years after the separation, Nicole Kidman sat down for an interview that would become one of the most revealing conversations about her marriage. And what she said fundamentally changed how people understood what had really happened. She talked about loneliness. Not the kind of loneliness that comes from being alone, but the kind that comes from being in a relationship where you feel fundamentally unseen. She described nights where Keith was on tour, and she was at home with the children, and she felt this crushing sense of isolation. She was married, but she felt single. She was part of a partnership, but she felt alone. She also revealed something that surprised many people. Nicole talked about the pressure of being the strong one in the relationship. She had portrayed herself and been portrayed by the media as the stable, accomplished, grounded partner. Keith had his career, but Nicole had her Oscar wins, her accolades, her industry respect. In some ways, that made her the bigger star in Hollywood's eyes. And that created a dynamic where Nicole felt responsible for holding everything together. If things fell apart, it would somehow be her fault. That weight was exhausting. What Nicole hadn't said publicly before was how much she had internalized the idea that a good wife sacrifices. A good wife puts her family first. A good wife supports her husband's dreams. A good wife is present, patient, and understanding. She had absorbed these messages, and she had lived by them. And over time, she had started to resent them. Not Keith for expecting them, but herself for believing them so completely. In another interview, Nicole mentioned something that seemed small, but was actually profound. She talked about how, after the divorce, she felt permission to want things again. She felt allowed to be ambitious. She felt allowed to say no to people. She felt allowed to be difficult and demanding about her career. And that freedom was almost intoxicating because she had given it up for so long. She also addressed the public narrative directly. The media had speculated endlessly about why the marriage ended. Was there infidelity? Was there abuse? Was there some dramatic betrayal? But Nicole explained that the truth was much less sensational and much more common. Two people had simply grown in different directions. They had different needs. They had different visions for their lives. And at some point, those differences became too large to bridge. If you enjoy discovering the hidden stories behind the world's biggest names, subscribe because every week we uncover the real truths that celebrities rarely share with the public. What was remarkable about Nicole's revelations was her refusal to paint herself as a victim or Keith as a villain. She could have blamed him for being on tour too much. She could have said he didn't support her career ambitions. She could have created a narrative where she was wronged, but she didn't. Instead, she took responsibility for her own choices and her own emotional journey. She talked about going to therapy. She discussed learning to prioritize her own needs. She mentioned understanding that being a good mother didn't mean sacrificing everything about herself. She revealed that she had struggled with depression during certain periods of the marriage, though she never explicitly blamed Keith for it. She acknowledged her own mental health journey and how that had affected her capacity to be present in the relationship. The most powerful revelation came when Nicole discussed forgiveness. Not forgiveness of Keith. She had already made clear she didn't blame him, but forgiveness of herself. She talked about letting go of the guilt. She discussed accepting that she had done the best she could with the information and emotional resources she had at the time. She talked about moving forward without carrying the weight of regret. For many people, marriage ends because of betrayal or anger, but Nicole's story reveals something more complex and more universal. Sometimes it ends because two people simply can't be who they need to be while remaining together. In the years after her divorce from Keith Urban, Nicole Kidman didn't disappear into bitterness or regret. Instead, she did something that few people in her position actually do. She transformed her pain into wisdom. She continued acting, and her career actually became more fulfilling. She won a Golden Globe for her role in Big Little Lies. She earned critical acclaim for The Undoing. She took on projects that challenged her and pushed her artistically. The freedom to be ambitious again, to say no to things she didn't want, to prioritize her own creative fulfillment. It changed her. She became more herself than she had been in years. But what was most striking was how she spoke about Keith in later interviews. There was no bitterness. There was no resentment. Instead, there was understanding and respect. She talked about him as a talented musician and a good father. She acknowledged the love they had shared. She simply admitted that love, no matter how real, isn't always enough to make a marriage work. Sometimes, two people can love each other deeply and still need to go separate ways. Keith Urban moved on too. He continued his music career. He remained active in their children's lives. By most accounts, they maintained a respectful, co-parenting relationship. It wasn't a fairy tale ending people had imagined in 2006, but it was something real. Two people who had tried their best and then made peace with the outcome. Everyone faces moments when they feel underestimated. Maybe you've had a dream that didn't work out the way you planned. Maybe you made sacrifices for love and later wondered if they were worth it. Maybe you felt like you were disappearing into someone else's life. Nicole's story tells you this. Your pain is valid, your needs matter, and choosing yourself isn't selfish, it's essential. The relationships that matter most are the ones where you can be fully yourself. The legacy of Nicole and Keith's relationship isn't a tragedy. It's actually something more valuable. It's a lesson in what happens when two talented, driven people try to build a life together and discover that sometimes the most loving thing they can do is let each other go. Nicole learned that being ambitious doesn't make you a bad mother or wife. She learned that sacrifice can turn into resentment if you're not careful. She learned that identity matters and that you can't pour from an empty cup. And she learned that the end of a relationship isn't always a failure. Sometimes it's just a different kind of success. Years later, when asked about her marriage, Nicole spoke with a piece that suggested she had truly moved forward. She wasn't angry. She wasn't heartbroken. She was grateful for what she had learned. She was proud of who she had become. And she was honest about the cost it had taken to get there. The fairy tale didn't end the way the world expected. But the real story, the story of a woman finding her way back to herself, was far more powerful than any fantasy.